being a woman in public life and in the workplace, and of being a member of the divided, highly competitive Johnson family. All of which makes for a fascinating tale, especially when told, as Rachel does, with characteristic wit, candor, and liveliness. And though it's filled with British politics, the book has considerable relevance to a US audience, revealing, as a review and Kirkus noted, how conservative extremism and the politics of fear are not just an American issue, but are reshaping the political world as we know it. Rachel will be in conversation with Danielle Crittenden, who also got her start in journalism and has gone on to write 4 books, beginning with What Our Mothers Didn't Tell Us, and the novel Amanda Bright at Home, which was the first modern work of fiction to be serialized in the Wall Street Journal. Danielle currently is host and executive producer of the Femsplainers podcast, which features conversations on what it calls serious women-oriented topics in not the usual politics way. So Rachel and Danielle, the screen is yours.
Thank you.
Thank you. You were saying just before we came on, Rachel, that you lived in Washington when your children, I remember we were friends back then, and your children were very small, and you lived in politics and prose pretty much. You didn't live far from them, in fact.
No, I lived just up the road from Politics and Prose, which as I remember, is on Connecticut Avenue. I was on Reno Road, and my weekend activity was to push my tiny children in a stroller. I think one of them could walk, the other 2 were in a double buggy. And I'd go passing the Starbucks on Connecticut Avenue and then spend a happy hour in Politics and Prose. So I want to thank Bradley for his hospitality this evening. And I feel so sad that I can't be here in person in Washington, DC. Of course, the US has just red listed our country, which means that I think travel is pretty off for this summer. And I want to thank you, Danielle, too, because as viewers and listeners may know, Danielle is famous in her own right, incredibly accomplished, a brilliant podcaster. And I have been lucky enough to guest on her Femsplainers podcast as well. So, I hope you're in good company tonight, folks, and you have a good evening. Even though this is a sort of slightly English subject, as Bradley said, I think it has some relevance to what has gone on in your country, obviously until Joe Biden took the White House. Have you got a dog there, Danielle? What are you doing? What is that?
My expression gave me away. My mother just walked in despite warnings to keep the, and she's trying to get on. She's registered for the event. And
good,
she's next to me. And,
that's hilarious.
I'm so sorry.
No, don't apologize to me. It's just like I've had to order my husband out of the room. I've got a puppy downstairs. I mean, it's mayhem.
I've also got somebody installing blinds in another room. So it's maximum craziness here. But anyway, thank you for your kind words. And as Bradley pointed out, I mean, you are long before Boris ascended to supreme power. You were very much a celebrity in your own right, and you've written books, and you're very, very well known in England.
Hardly.
Anyway, as you wrote in your book, but then you said sort of, this struck me as a little sad, given my primary role in public life as Boris's sisters, newspapers caption photos of me, Rachel Johnson, sister of Boris, as if it were my day job, like being a plumber. So
it's just maddening.
So
sometimes I'm in a photograph with, like, for example, Bradley mentioned I applied to be a candidate and was selected to be a candidate for this party called Change UK. Yeah. And in the lineup of candidates, they had Gavin Esler, who was a presenter of Newsnight, which is like the nightly, the really heavyweight news political show. Yeah. They had a former finance minister of Poland, and they had a former cabinet minister who was also trying to. And so each one of these guys was given their former job. And then it said, and Rachel Johnson, sister of Boris, as if that was my job. And I remember looking at this caption. It was in the Times newspaper, thinking, we haven't come a long way, baby. I've written 8 books. I've presented, I've got my own radio show. I've presented documentaries. I've got a show on Sky. I've got 3 kids. How can this be how you are still defined?
Yes. Well,
That's-
this is what I'm hoping with this interview tonight, your time, late afternoon, our time, is that we get to know you a bit more and talk about there's a lot in the book that's autobiographical, and I just want to echo Bradley. It's incredibly entertainingly written.
Well, thank you.
And I want to sort of situate you as a personality for our American audience. So let's begin.
Recording in progress.
Sorry, Mom.
I think this is comical.
Mom, I think you should go to another room. Thank you.
I love it.
She's very keen to see you. She's a big fan, Rachel.
Well, I'm very pleased. I'm pleased to have you.
So, okay. So the family, orient us to the Johnsons, the Johnson family that you grew up in. It's been described, as you noted, as a cross between the Kennedys and the Kardashians. I don't know, are you Chloe, like, or Teddy?
I'm embarrassed to say I don't know the Kardashians. I mean, obviously I've seen Kim. I went to a party once and I actually stood behind Kim Kardashian so I could examine the famous curvature for myself.
It's unnatural, right?
She is tiny. Anyway,
yeah.
She's tiny. You know, it's not natural. My family's odd. I mean, I say in the book that I always knew we were different in some way. You know, I think I said all countries feel they are exceptional, but I think some families feel different from the beginning. And I think ours was very different because my parents were so young when they had me and Boris. I mean, my father was like 24, my mother was 22 when she had Boris, and she was 23 when she had me. Then she had 4 kids really soon. And now I have children myself of the age they were when they had 3. I realized that, you know, they were, I say babies when they had babies. Obviously that's not true because they had to grow up very fast. What makes you an adult is becoming a parent. But that's not quite true. I mean, I feel I only really became an adult when I was about 45. So actually, I think my parents really weren't properly adults when they had us. So we benefited from a weird thing, which was a huge amount of parental energy, but they were totally committed to their own lives. So we were very much left to bring up ourselves. My father once said something like, parenting is far too important to be left to parents. And, you know, he basically relied on the experts. So he sent us, whatever money we had was spent on education. So he was a civil servant. He didn't earn a good salary. He went from being an academic to being a civil servant. My mother, you know, was 21, so she didn't have a fully formed career. So she painted and she looked after us. And then when I was 7, she went into a mental hospital, and that was basically it. So we really parented ourselves. She's an amazing woman, but you know, it was a lot for her to have 4 kids so soon. I mean, by the age of 28 or whatever it was. And so we kind of made our own, you know, what that thing that happens when kids, you know, grow up by themselves. My father's a brilliant, brilliant father too, but basically we were left to get on with it. We had books, we had clothes, we had a roof, but then we made our own fun and our own games, and we're a tight unit. And I think that's been very formative. We're very self-contained, you know. We know that the world is kind of hard and dangerous and scary. We were all sent to boarding school quite early. My mum was in hospital. My father was traveling the world. So, you know, we became independent adults really fast. So we had very young parents, but as children, we had to self-actualize very, very quickly. And I think that is why, you know, you see my brother becoming prime minister, basically, because he knew he had to just get there on his own. And, you know, he saw the goal, he went for it. You know, nobody's going to do it for you. That's what we learned quite soon.
Well, I thought I'm I guess, I think 2 years older than you are, but
Yeah.
we both were children of the 1970s.
Oh yeah, free range.
what you were describing is like, I think you mentioned the ice storm, which for anybody who was a child in the 70s was the form that was the most accurate movie of what it was like to be a child in the 70s. We were all free range. And I sort of wonder, like, why did our generation become such helicopter parents? Oh, because we were so neglected. We were just allowed to run feral. And your writing about that really captures that. But you also talked about the dynamics within your family with your older brother Boris, who later, just I think quite recently, credited the birth of you for his ambition.
That's very true, and I'm really touched by him saying this. I think he's been interviewed a couple of times, and I was the first person who revealed that, as very small children, we were both asked what we wanted to be. So I was 5 and he was 6. And we were actually in Washington, D.C., because my parents were living on Morrison Street, because my father was working for the World Bank. And somebody came to the house and said, Alexander, because he was christened Alexander Boris, he's now Prime Minister, known as Boris all over the world. So what would you like to be when you grow up, both of you? And for some reason, I answered first, which was a mistake, because that means I left an open goal for him. So I said, I want to be a wife and mother, because as far as I was aware, those were the options available to women. My mother painted, but she had very little time. She had 4 children. My grandmother, was a grandmother. My other grandmother was a hill farmer's wife on Exmoor with a sheep farm, and kept, lambs in the bottom of the Aga when they were newborn. And I didn't know anybody who had a career. Yeah, it's a sort of stove. I didn't know women who had careers. My parents' friends were sort of diplomats, and, they were ambassadors, or they were journalists, they were editors, they worked for the World Bank. But it was always the men who had the high-flown status career. And it was often the women who were in a supportive role. So that's why I answered wife and mother. And to finish the anecdote, so then this guy, and I won't say who it was because it won't mean much, but it was an editor of a left-wing news magazine, turned to my brother, who was 6, whatever, and said, and Alexander Boris, what would you like to do when you grow up? And he said, I want to be world king. And I remember this was like, it pierced me like a shaft, because I thought, is that a job? And can girls apply? And why does he think he can be world king? And my ambition at this point is to be a wife and mother. And that's one of the themes of the book, is how he achieved his ambition at a huge cost, really, to his personal life, essentially. I've achieved my ambition in my 20s, and I've also done some other things, but in no sense am I, going to be written up in the history books. If anything, I'm a pub quiz question, a footnote, whereas he's, already having biographies written. And in a way, what I thought was interesting about the book and the arc of the book was that even though I was born in 65, he was born in 64, I'm born female, him born male, the scope of ambition of our different sexes is still quite determined by our gender.
Mm-hmm. What were some of you had these descriptions of him as a young boy. He's like very bookish. He would recreate ancient naval battles in his bathroom sink. And you also, and you had 3 other brothers, and no other.
I was one of 4. Yeah. So 3 boys and me. Yeah.
Right. And it was always sort of mayhem that other children, despite your brother would not, their mothers would not let them come and play at your house because it was, you guys were so rough.
We were considered too rough. There was quite a lot of fighting, physical fighting, and competition, and rough sports, and lots of kind of vigorous cricket, and there's this game called British Bulldog, where essentially you get your heads down and your shoulders down, and you run at each other. It's amazing I'm alive, basically. And also my grandmother used to make us climb trees. And they, you know, there was these, we have this farm in Somerset that's unbelievably beautiful, but there were these spindly little plum trees. And we used to climb like 20 yards up these trees, and she'd just say, higher, higher. And I felt I had to climb higher, you know, so that was another sort of emblematic moment.
In fact,
I felt as a girl, as the only girl, I had to be more of a boy than they were.
Right. Well, the only friend who was allowed to come was Boris's future, now ex-wife, Marina, at 6. So,
True.
Marina, sorry.
That's very
okay, so fast forward, then, as you say, you're the only girl in this very rambunctious, super competitive family. And yet you ended up at a boys' boarding school, like as the only, like, how did that even happen? How did they let a girl?
Well, that was because I was, well, that, if I'm allowed to tell the story, I will, because it's quite a good one. So when we were living in Brussels, because my father was when one of the first waves of British civil servants to go and build the new European community, the EEC as it was then called. And so we all moved to Brussels in about 1973, which was right at the beginning of our participation in the European project and the political structures and all the rest of it. And so we were enrolled in this school called the European School. And because it was Britain's first year of membership, there weren't that many British children to be educated in Brussels. So we were all put together in one class. So I was in the same class as Boris, and I think Leo, my younger brother by 2 years. Anyway, so it was quite kind of chaotic. And I think Boris had been put down for Eton. And so he was 10 and I was 9, or he was 9 and I was 8. And the school called in my parents and they said, we need to talk to you. And we all assumed that, you know, we were in trouble. We'd been too rough in the playground, because all these kind of the nationalities used to fight each other in the playground. And bizarrely, the Danes were always really aggressive and the Germans were very peaceable. So we couldn't think what, anyway, so they went and they saw the teacher, who was my teacher too. And they said, we can't educate Alexander here. And they said, why not? Thinking, oh my God, he's being expelled. And they said, he is doué, he's gifted. And if you want him to go to an English public school, which is where you go when you're 13, and public means private, you know, you'll have to send him to an English prep school. So then they took advice as to which prep schools. They were recommended 2. They rang up the one that they was smaller and sort of was basically an Eton feeder school. And the headmaster was thrilled because, you know, my father called him and said, I've got this child, he's gifted. And so you could see the headmaster thinking, we're going to get a scholarship or whatever. So the man said he would take Alexander Boris sight unseen. And my father rubbed his hands and he said, great. And then he said, so there are 3 more where Boris came from. And Clive, who was their master, said, that's great. And so my father said, and Rachel will start in the following September. And he said, no, Stanley, we don't take girls. And my father said, tough, you do now. So I was sent, the only girl, into an English prep school from Brussels. And that was obviously a very formative experience as well, because, you know, you learn how to fight your own corner. But in a way, it was not fish out of water, because so much of being a woman in England, the years I've grown up, has been like, you're breaking new ground the entire time. You know, you're the first girl in your prep school, then you're one of a very few girls in your public school, and then you're one of, you go into what was an all-male college at Oxford. Then you go to the Financial Times, which is where I started my career. I was the first female graduate trainee. It was only when then I went to the Foreign Office for a year. I was the only woman in my department. I had my first female boss in 1994, when I went to the BBC for 2 years before I came to Washington. So, you know, in a way, being an only girl at a boys' prep school was the perfect preparation for life as a woman in Britain, where, you know, there is still not representation and there is still a huge authority gap between men and women, you know, whatever you say, even though we've had 2 female prime ministers, you know, 1 female first minister in Scotland, 1 female first minister in Northern Ireland, a female who runs the Met Police. there's still, they are still the exceptions.
Well, and part of it is the clubbiness, as you describe, which we have a little bit of it in the United States, like if you go to an Ivy League college, if you go to Yale and Harvard, but male or female, you make these friends for life and you help each other, from what I've gathered. But the boarding school is a completely different thing, and it's a feeder. Like you were a year above David Cameron. Boris, of course, was there. Michael Gove, I think, was he? Like everybody comes through the school together, and they go from like Oxford to Westminster. Like it's something that we just don't have in the United States, but is intense there.
Yeah, I think it's a bit like France, where they have the École Sciences Politiques, whatever it's called, Sciences Po, where they all go, or the civil service college. They have the same sort of pipeline of people who go from, but it's different because in France they have the lycée system, which is not private. I mean, forgive me if I say this, but in France and America, you go to state schools unless you need extra help, or your parents just want you to go to the same prep school as they did. I'm not particularly clear about that. But in this country, in Britain, there's a huge premium on private education, which means that the privately educated still have a real lock on so many of the citadels of power, the important institutions, the top jobs. And, this is changing, but it's not changing that fast, because when you have, an education system which is hugely funded by private money versus a state system that's underfunded, and let's talk about what's happened to education during the pandemic. I mean, it's been a catastrophe. The inequalities are writ large, and they're getting larger.
Right. So let's fast forward now to the Brexit referendum. I actually was in London on the night, on the eve of Brexit, probably hanging out with some of your friends or your brother's friends.
Who are you with?
I will not
say, Danielle, you can't leave me hanging like this.
No, I'll tell you after. But anyway, everybody, it was really eerily foreshadowed what was going to happen in the American election in November.
No.
And
do you think, by the way, Danielle, do you think that because Brexit went the populist vote, the nationalist vote, the isolationist vote, do you think that gave a wind for Trump?
I have no idea. I think the winds were there, and you saw it with Brexit, and you saw it with Trump. And what was interesting to me was that the so-called elites at the table who voted for Brexit did it. They were talking about it in a kind of larky way, like that they never expected it to pass.
You're right.
And when they woke up the next morning, of course, everybody was flabbergasted. You even have, I think, including your own brother, because you have this. So part of the emergence of your political career was, at that time, Boris was a journalist, correct? And he had written, I'm sorry.
Not at the time of Brexit, no, because he'd been mayor and he was an MP.
Right, right, of course. Yeah. But he had written 2 articles. I think of him in his journalistic mode.
Yeah, he was writing a column for the Telegraph, and he wrote 2 columns, one in favour of Britain remaining in the EU and one in favour of Britain leaving. I was with him that day he wrote them, and he was saying it was a way of putting his thoughts in order, and it's only by putting things down that he knows. And he said to me that as soon as he wrote the Leave one, he knew that was the right answer. And I read both of them. And when I read the Remain one, I found it incredibly convincing. And I read the Leave one, and I was like, this is nothing. You haven't set out a single advantage. So, we completely divided on it.
Right. And then tell us then how this led you. Rachel, you've been on, aside from your journalistic accomplishments, I think our American audience would appreciate knowing that you were also on celebrity reality shows.
Listen, I held my hand up to that because the checks, you know, my husband sometimes says, if you do that show, I'm going to divorce you. And then I say, well, this is what they've offered. And he says, I'll divorce you if they don't. You know, it's
no,
just
but
like,
I mean, here you are, but I'm raising this for two reasons. One, it makes you one of the most unlikely then candidates for politics that you've been, although as Trump demonstrates, reality shows can be good for you. But you
listen, there's a huge intersectionality now between reality TV and politics.
Also,
and politicians are doing it all the time.
And you
what?
dormed with you were rooming in with a woman you were then running against when you joined the Change Party. So let's talk a little bit about your journey to become an unlikely political candidate, especially when you know your brother's sort of filling that role for the time being.
I know. Well, so I guess what was it? It was 2019. It must have been right at the beginning of 2019, and I think England was in this terrible gridlock because the Remainers were blocking parliamentary progress on Brexit, essentially. And we should have left the EU, and I can't remember the exact details were, but because the whole thing dragged out so much, there was a legal requirement for the UK to field candidates for the European Parliament. So this new party arose, it sprung up, and it took people from the left and the right and the centre, and like 10 MPs left the main parties and formed a new party. And it was like a great prison break of politics. And when it happened in February 2019, it was really exciting because people thought, at last, the dispossessed in the centre ground, who don't feel represented by the craziness of Jeremy Corbyn and his, you know, very far left agenda, tainted by the anti-Semitism of the Labour Party of the time. They didn't feel part of that. They also didn't like the fact that the Tories had been taken over by the Vote Leave caucus, you know, the ones who wanted to take us out of the EU and to have, you know, global Britain, rule Britannia and all that, the nationalist rhetoric. I mean, most of the country felt dispossessed. They felt orphaned by what happened after the referendum. So when this party popped up, and it was really exciting, and I registered to it as a supporter. And as a registered supporter, when we had to field candidates for the European Parliament, they sent me an email saying, would you like to represent us as a candidate? And I was like, you know, there are times in your life where you have to stand up, you know, and because otherwise you go to your grave and, you know, thinking, when that stuff was going on that I thought was really regrettable, and we were having kind of almost black shirty type rallies in London led by Nigel Farage, who he's a guy I work with occasionally. He's, you know, you may know who I'm talking about. But there was a sort of populist fervour, and I found it really horrible. It was like going back to the 30s. And I just felt I had to register a stand because I think partly because of my surname as well. I didn't want everyone to assume that, you know, as a woman, I would naturally fall into line with what the dominant apex predator males in my family thought or said or did. And I really futile protest, I might add, because this party it's in like 90 seats and we didn't win a single one, and it has now folded. It was the shortest lived political party in modern British political history. But you know what? They changed the weather. But, you know, in the end, the move really understand. When you leave London, and understand it more, because people don't have so many, you know, it's not so outside the great cities, the metropolitan, the university towns, you know, people just didn't want to be, they wanted to run themselves. And I understand that feeling and that impulse too.
I'm sorry, Rachel, my Wi-Fi went a little wobbly, but I got most of
Okay.
it.
No, don't worry.
Forgive me about
I was just talking
again.
about the Brexit impulse.
But you even angered, I mean, I just felt reading this. First of all, I was walking around after reading about your political campaign feeling incredibly stressed out. And I was going like, why am I so stressed out? And I realized it was so upsetting to read. Well, you're a very good sport, but the absolutely horrible attacks upon you, the complete lack of support from your family, including your own husband. I get Boris, but your husband Ivo was annoyed because he thought he should be running, and then you had these
That's very true.
brutal attacks in the press, and then you would do something like a journalist, and you would say something, and of course it would be all over the news, and people were waiting for you to say things that could be quotable and used against Boris. And I don't know, you must have reptilian skin or something. What is like the thick elephant? I don't know how you came through that. It was so brutal to read about.
Well, I mean, what people assume that if you put yourself out there, especially if you're a woman, that you are, what is it, fair game. They attack you for everything, from how you look to how you sound, especially in my case, my hair. I mean, there's whole like a mum's net threads about my hair.
By the way, your hair is as famous as Boris's, but you comb yours.
No. I don't comb it. If I comb it, listen, I don't know what happens when he combs it, because I don't know if he ever has, but I never comb my hair. Never. Wow. Because I've got so much, it would literally be like this massive afro around my head. It's, you know what? It's the cost of doing business. And I don't take it very seriously. And often if you meet someone who's been rude to you in print, or on Twitter, or, they are usually charming. And you have to recognize that it's like, when you put people behind a typewriter, they often turn into psychopaths, or behind a screen, they turn into psychopaths. In real life, they're perfectly normal. And you've got to recognize that this is what the internet's done to everybody, to every single social media platform. I could say something on Twitter that's not me, and you've got to live with it. I don't know. I don't think I get it too badly, actually. I'm amazed by how little I get attacked, actually, not by how much I get attacked. Because I suppose what I'm comparing to is, every time I listen to the news or turn on the radio in the morning or open Twitter, my brother is trending, and, people are vile. So what I get compared to what he gets, it's nothing.
Well, at least you have that comparison, because if you didn't, for better or worse, I don't know. I don't know how you came through, but it was impressive. But all right, so now it didn't, no spoiler alert, you didn't get elected to the European Parliament.
Thank God.
And it's been, a year since you finished the book. And Boris has always been so public. Obviously, he was a super successful mayor, and now he's prime minister. How has it affected your life now? I mean, it must be to the power of 100 that you write about now, getting lobbied by people like on the tube. Everybody's trying to get through you to get to your brother. On the other hand, there are upsides. You got to play tennis at Chequers. So what's it been like?
I'm trying to think how to answer it. I mean, I didn't think I would ever adjust to it. And it's only been in the past few months, I think, that I haven't felt this complete sense of surreality about it, because there are very few people, my brother's one of 55 men or women who's become prime minister. In fact, I think some became prime minister twice. So it's about 50 human beings in my country since the dawn of time have been prime minister. And so there aren't very many sisters of the prime minister, and there's no job description for it. And it is very hard because I host a radio show and there's 3 hours of people ringing up and I have to really navigate these tricky corners all the time when some of them are so angry. You know, I have to say, you know, I really don't mind talking about policy, but I can't, you know, you can't put me in the position of defending my sibling. So we have all of that. But I have sort of adjusted weirdly to the new reality, which is that he is prime minister. He'd probably be prime minister for another 10 years. And, you know, I'm inordinately proud of his achievement because, you know, as I say, 50 people have done it. It takes incredible stamina and verve and guts and tenacity and self-sacrifice to do something like that. It really does, because the system here is not presidential. You have to work the constituencies, you have to tramp the streets, you have to deliver leaflets. On voting day, you have to knock on people's doors yourself as the candidate. And that's whether you're, you know, an MP or prime minister. He's still a constituency MP. My brother Joe was also a constituency MP and a minister. And I take my hat, after having stood in a very small way for politics, I take my hat off to people who
It's, I think Rachel is frozen. It's hard to tell. I saw a message from Politics and Prose that Rachel is frozen. Oh. Okay. All right, Rachel, her Wi-Fi may be even worse than mine. But let's hope she comes back. And I see questions are building in the side in the Q&A. So anybody who has a question, I'm going to go to them almost immediately. Just type it in your Q&A. If you don't see that, it's at the bottom on your Zoom screen. And you can just line up questions and I will go through and ask them for you.
Sorry.
Rachel, are you back?
I'm back. I don't know what happened there. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I thought it was my Wi-Fi. So it was really hard to say like who had the worst Wi-Fi, you know?
We've got a storm here. I'm so sorry, everybody, but I'm back.
Okay, so you were talking about being proud of your brother.
Hugely, yeah.
And the effects on your life. And
no, but also my newfound admiration for politicians, right. Anybody, for civil servants, anybody who is in the public, you know, in the public sector, essentially, all they get is people sort of trying to work out, see if they've been taking public money. It's so the reverse. They've been spending their own money to serve the public in most cases.
Well, one of the things you write about that is very resonant for Americans as well. I mean, we are all, as you know, we've gone through our own Brexit time, except it's with Donald Trump. The country remains as divided, if not more divided and polarized than ever. And you, at one point in your book, you wrote about saying, like, by also, even if I disagree with my brother, that doesn't mean I'm not, as you just said, I'm still proud of my brother. And how have you as a family come through it with these divides? Because I think, as you pointed out, this was a kind of lesson we all hope, like in England, the Leavers and Remainers might get along. And certainly in the United States, families have been divided as well. And what kind of advice can you give on this?
Well, I think that there was this tacit decision in our family that if we wanted to rub along at, you know, birthdays and celebrations and Christmases and things like that, we can't let politics get in the way of family. And my brother also has a genius for just like lightening the mood, and nobody sits around with a long face saying, you know, the trade with the EU has dropped by 40% or anything like that over the dinner table, because nobody wants to, you know, it's crying over spilt milk at this point. We have left the EU. However bad it's going to be, complaining and moaning isn't going to change it. So everybody I think in this country has just decided, you know, we've got to try and make the best of it. COVID in a way has been a rather lucky break, because I used the word before so I can use it again. The shit show of COVID means that it has masked the shit show of Brexit. Okay, so it's going to be very hard. So in a sense, nobody can say, you know, you can't really separate out the economic damage or the education damage or whatever of Brexit. No, let's just leave it to economics, because they could say, well, that was COVID. The reason all the stuff is stuck in the ports, it's because of COVID. COVID is going to be a blanket get out of jail from now for the foreseeable.
That's so interesting. Yes, because it was just before COVID hit that, as you predicted, you started to see the unbelievable numbers of cars and trucks lining up now at Calais and on the English side, as suddenly there was this new bureaucracy for trade, and I mean, people are nightmarishness of what is going to happen when you bring down that wall between England and Europe.
Yeah, people are giving up. I mean, like English cheesemakers who always sold their stock in Germany, France, rest of Europe, just giving up because the cost of doing business it can't be mitigated by the profits. So people are giving up. You know, we're going to become a much more self-contained, self-sufficient island with much less trade with Europe. We may, you know, supplement some of that with trade from, you know, New Zealand and Australia. But my point there is, if your government's aim is to be a net zero economy, it makes no real sense to replicate the trade with a huge trading bloc 22 miles away on your doorstep with a small, you know, smaller economies sort of 9,500 miles away. You know, I trained at the FT. I still can't see the economic or diplomatic logic to the decision this country has taken.
Well, and it's got Trumpian resonance over here, because I remember what you were writing about being, I guess in Plymouth, major fishing industry. This was part of your area that you were running in. And you were telling them, like, your fish is being sold in Europe and that's going to go away. And it was like a cut-nosed, slight-face situation. They did not care.
I was in Cornwall addressing a meeting. It was a question time event, like a big one in a university. And a lot of fishermen were in the audience, literally wearing their fisherman's smocks. And I'd done a bit of research, and 80% of the Cornish catch goes to France. So after, you know, whatever it was, January the 1st, 2020, when did we actually leave? 2020. That cat, 80% of their fish, where does it go? You know, who are you selling it to? Don't you care?
Right, so, and you're in the university that EU funds built, this lavish.
Yeah, and I was sitting there in an EU-funded university. It was like fantastic canteen. I was like, look around, you guys. You know, no, but the basic point on that is the emotional argument will never defeat an economic. The emotional argument will always defeat an economic argument, right? And there was no point in even having that fight. I mean, once you have one side saying, Britain first, we're the greatest country in the world, we don't need the nasty frogs and krauts.
Right.
You know, they tell us what to do. We want to take back control. These are powerful messages to a country, an offshore island country, an independent state. And these messages cut through, and all the other messages, the contravening messages, they could easily bill as though this is Davos man telling you, speaking from their private jet in Davos on why your sectors, should be, I don't know, integrated or whatever. It was a sort of Financial Times, economist style. We tried to meet the vote leave arguments with a sort of FT leader type, an FT, what do you call a leader in America?
Editorial.
Editorial. We tried to meet the sort of really emotional vote leave arguments about kind of we're the greatest country in the world, Britannia should rule the waves. We don't want anyone telling us what to do with, this is going to be very bad for the economy. GDP is going to fall by the X percent if we do this and X percent if we do that. And inflation will do this, and that there'll be unemployment, and also all the EU workers who keep the whole bloody NHS afloat, not to mention hospitality, will leave. None of that mattered. It's as if nothing you said that was going to significantly affect our lives mattered. All that mattered was being told, we just had to wave the flag and everything would be fine.
Right. There was a big stick it to the man quality of that year in politics.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go to questions. We've got some lining up here. All of you anonymous attendees, come on, we should have some names here. Nobody wants to give their name.
God, they're probably my trolls. Probably my trolls.
Let me see. Yeah. Let me see. Hang on. Okay. Okay, anonymous attendee number 1. As a woman who's always, quote unquote, sister Boris Johnson, are you also then always on the hook for answering for his mistakes?
Oh, all the time, all the time. It's like policy for him. I can't. And also, what mistakes? It's very odd. People it's bizarre, they think I'm responsible too. Of course I'm not. And also the other thing I get is people saying, will you tell your brother? And then I get some unbelievably superficial, specious thing. Or I get a really big thing, which is the Sri Lankans need vaccines and you've got them. And, so you have this kind of terrible kind of, you go into, it's like a roller coaster every day. You don't know what's going to hit you.
Right. I think you mentioned at one point your son got an email from someone he hadn't seen for a long time who was having a passport issue. Could you solve it?
You read the book, really? Yeah, even my poor kids, somebody washed their passport and said, could they ask me to ask my brother to get them a new passport?
Right.
It's like, you've got to laugh. You've really got to laugh.
Right. I remember my husband worked briefly in a White House here, and I would marvel at people who would come up to him and sort of clear their throat and say, I think the president should say this on immigration. And then they would unroll a full speech that they thought should be the president's words. And it was kind of hilarious, but it's exactly that vicarious. Okay, next question, another anonymous attendee. What's next for you?
Okay, I'm very busy. I don't know. I find that lockdown, it was weirdly busy as well as being very empty. And I started doing a radio show on a channel called LBC, which I think you can listen to online, 7 to 10 on Sunday evenings, which I adore, because one of the great things about going into my little foray into politics was it made you realize that people aren't thinking what you're thinking, and you've really got to get out of your bubble, out of your comfort zone, and out of your, I'm sitting in Notting Hill, in streets where the house is worth 20 million. I mean, mine isn't, obviously, but 20 million, 30 million, 10 million. It's not real. They've got Filipinas, they've got nannies, they've got homework nannies, they've got, everything. And you think because you read the papers and you read Twitter that you know what people think. Country, all over this country, but all over the world. And it's every single evening is an education, not for them, but for me, because they ring in and I'm amazed by the callers. And I do a podcast which is called Difficult Women, and everybody's welcome to come on that, listen to that, subscribe to that. And I'm writing a new book, which I'm not talking about because that's bad luck. And yeah, no, busy.
Okay, next, an anonymous attendee.
Why, guys?
Yeah, come on. What would you have done differently for/during the height of the movement? I guess the Brexit movement.
Well, that's a good question. I don't know. I feel a bit guilty that as soon as I joined Change UK, I realized it was doomed. And I had that instinct that Nora Ephron, you know, her famous line, everything is copy. And I certainly didn't go into politics to write the book. But when something's going really badly wrong, it makes much better copy than when it's going very well. So I just started making notes. And
that's like a true journalist.
Yeah, I mean, if something's not, the way I make something okay as an experience is to write about it, to turn it into copy. So it was a very painful and very fruitless experience, but I learned so much from it. So one of the points of the book is to encourage women to participate in public life. And I'm not saying you have to stand to be a senator or a congresswoman or anything, because local politics or, you know, neighborhood politics is just as frenzied and just as vicious as national politics is. As I learned, you know, when I was sat on my communal garden committee, I mean, all politics is bloody, I think. But, you know, we need.
I like how you didn't survive that committee, yet you go.
It was terrifying. It was terrifying.
They are terrifying.
It's terrifying. So, but, you know, we need more women in politics. And one of my themes over the last 18 months has been, we've had a pandemic and the government has had to run a country during lockdowns. And I felt very strongly that there have been no women in the room when big decisions about, you know, who's allowed into a care home, who's allowed, you know, how should kids go to school? All these decisions, it seemed to me, were taken without any reference to women who are still the majority, who have the caring responsibilities in many households. And that infuriated me. And the only way we're going to stop that and make that better and have better decision making is to have more women in the room. So the point of my whole experience was, I was a failure as a politician, but I learned a huge amount about the importance of having better decision making with women involved, and a broader spectrum also of opinion and policy. And you know, you can't tell women they have to go back. The message, I can remind you, was stay home. Okay, that was the government order, whereas people who had key worker status were allowed out. So basically you saw the women of Britain were sent back home. They had to homeschool, they had to cook, they had to clean, they had to shop as best they could. Their husbands helped, but all the surveys showed that like 70% of women did double shift and 30% of men did a bit more. So I felt that the pandemic pinged us back to 40 years ago, 50 years ago, which is why it's really, really important that, you know, people like me say things like this, and women younger than me go into politics and make it better.
We have two more questions. It says, another anonymous attendee, I'm sorry you may have said, but how did the rest of your family handle your participation in the movement? We did speak a little bit about that, but if there's anything you wanted to add or expand upon.
Well, there's nothing really to say,
I don't think, how did your kids?
Nobody ever said anything. I don't think I said a single thing.
Yeah, in the book, that was so strange. And they'd seen you on Celebrity Apprentice, but your kids, it was like, oh, this is something mom's doing again. Like you also have a.
They pretended it wasn't happening. They pretended it wasn't happening. Nobody even said good luck. Nobody even said break a leg. Nobody even said, how's it going? No, it didn't happen.
Why?
Because it was partly because it was absurd, because it became clear right from the beginning that this party was going nowhere. So I
was
think,
like, oh, Rachel's doing it.
like, oh, poor Rachel, oh dear. So I think they maybe felt it was best not, best left unsaid.
All right, last question by a named person. Thank you. Melanie Dubois. Hi, Rachel. This
Hi.
is Penny Custer, as I was, Olivia's mother. What a charming talk. I'm proud to know you. How is your mother?
Oh, Penny. Hi, Penny. Why? Yes, I remember you were called Melanie. So you're no longer with Scott. Anyway, my mum, I saw her today. I've moved her. I'm not going to say the name of her place, but she's in a lovely convent/nursing home. And I think she's getting a good level of care. And that's a very new development. She's been at home, but she's now needs a level of care that one person can't provide in a domiciliary setting. So we have taken the sad decision to place her in what's called a care home here. I don't know, what do you call them there?
Yeah, would you call them nursing homes?
Nursing homes, yeah. But it's a lovely place. It has dogs, it has nuns. They had a fair. I bought her a cream tea, which is like a scone with jam and cream today. And I watched her eat it, what can I say?
Is she aware of what everybody is doing in the family?
Sure. I gave her a copy of the book.
Yeah.
And she has it by her bed, and she's reading it, which gives me pleasure. She's wonderful. She's a wonderful painter. She used to live in New York. I spent a lot of time in America, and my mum's mother is American. So.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a painting of you, both your photograph with your siblings in Downing Street with a painting that your mother painted. Yes. Before we go, Mom, any questions now that you're in the room?
That's a good idea. Come on.
She just said, sorry she interfered. It's wonderful. But she says it's wonderful listening to you. So.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm so pleased. I'm very honored.
Anyway, thank you, Rachel. I feel like I have a whole sheet more questions for you. Your life
Danielle, it's been a joy. It's been a joy. You're such a professional. And thank you, Bradley.
Well, great moderating, Danielle. Say hi to your mom from all of us here. And Rachel, apart from being a very entertaining read, there's so much insight and reflection in your book. So much insight about politics, gender, family, and more. If you were going to lose an election, at least you made the best of it by emerging with an engaging and instructive book.
Oh, that's so kind.
To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of RAKE'S Progress. Here's the cover. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.